So I don't know if you can see this photo of this man. This was a rapper that was real popular. Um, he was signed to a Bad Boy Records label by the name of it went by the name of Black Rob. So I don't normally do this kind of stuff, but I felt compelled to do it because I saw a documentary that flashed across my screen, and it was a group of people from Gargantuan, I believe it's Gargantuan Films, and it was a few of his associates that put together a documentary about the last days of Black Rob. And I particularly grew up in a time where hip hop was taking off, and it was like a big thing, like the beginning of it, and when it went into full swing, and all the way up to the '90s to the 2000s. So I was like uh, in it, like from the early '80s all the way up to the 2000s. So I'm pretty full aware of that music era, and he was one of the ones that I kind of took a liking to his style of music. But what was sad was I was, looking at the documentary, and I started realizing just how cutthroat the industry is. And so the reason why I'm doing this is because I noticed that with these rapper people, recently there's been a lot of shootings. There's been killing of young artists that are trying to start out into the whole uh, arena of rap before they even get their foot on the ground. And you hear all these tragedies, and it's not even just with the hip hop music. It's with other genres of music like R&B artists. There was a show that would come on called Unsung, and they would show all the tragedies. And in particular, what I noticed is they did make mention of how when the lights go out, one of the guys he referred to it as when the lights go out, a nobody gives a care about the artists themselves. It's like the person's name is in lights. They're big when they're on stage, but when the lights go out and when all of the thrill is gone, it's like who's at the end of the day going to care about the artists and their well-being. So in his last days, it looked like he was going through a lot having to do with his kidneys and diabetes, and having to need dialysis, and then having to go through a surgery, and he had a couple of strokes, and he really lost a lot of weight. He didn't seem like he was a really big guy, but in his healthier days, he wasn't as small as he was at the very end. And I think that was due to the illness that he had suffered with, and then the strokes. But what I notice is, in particular, the reason why I'm doing this, I notice even with Craig Mack, you know, um, you notice now, I'm just an outsider and I'm looking in, and I know maybe some of these people that are connected to the people from the East Coast, music industry, if it's pretty much goes hand in hand like West Coast, East Coast. um, what I noticed, it seems like um, that was a tragedy with what happened to Craig Mack, um, who did the song "Flavor in Your Ear," and he did a number of other another a number of other songs. it just seemed like people that were in connection with Puffy Combs. You hear that I noticed he's living good, and I'm just gonna say this. I don't know if you guys see this or not. He's living good. He is in Puffy Combs. He seems like he's doing well financially. He looked like he's living good. But the artists that he had dealt with, I don't really hear about a lot of them that are living as well as he's living. And so I'm just leaving that out there for you. I'm throwing that out there. Um, when the guy mentioned on the documentary about when the lights go out with these artists, who gives a care about them? I noticed that the industry seems like it has a lot of demons, a lot of things that they do to these artists that are real tragic in the end. And I almost feel like it also has to do with money. A big percentage of the problems have to do with money and not being paid what you're worth. And like even with Cardi in the beginning, there was a whole big thing about you know the people she signed with in the beginning when she started out. Now I know that she's pretty full aware of how to be careful of not signing contracts with people who are going to take a large percentage of your profits for what you worked hard for. um what I notice in particular with the music business, it just does not seem like it's very easy as it may seem in the light. We hear the music and we hear the artists and we enjoy their music and we enjoy their work, but I've heard all too often these tragedies and these stories about they may be rich on stage, but in the background you don't know what their lives are like or what they're going through. um I just thought it was really sad. It was what I thought was cool was in the documentary. What they mentioned is that he had went to an amusement park, and he shared money with he gave money to the kids, and he shared his enjoyment by going out there and taking photos with people. He spoke to people, and I kind of feel like that was his way of you know making peace with whatever happened. That was his last days of happy fulfillment before he passed. He knew that probably his time was coming, and that was his way of trying to. People will do things like that. They do strange things when they know they're going to die. And it was really emotional. And the people that he had surrounded by him weren't even family members. And from what was said in the documentary is that I'm assuming that his relationship with his family was uh, pretty strained. That it wasn't what it should have been, and that was on a whole nother personal level. But the people he did have surrounding him, they were there at a time when he needed them, and they did what they had to do, and they were sent there for a reason, so that he could have a good home going, as they would say. They were his support system, even though you know you may not be blood relation to some people. Sometimes some people are sent in your life for a reason, and if they're there to help you through a storm, then that's what they're there for. And you you go through that storm and they go through it with you. And I felt like in hearing that story of what happened to this guy, um maybe he has a backstory. Maybe he wasn't the greatest person. Maybe he wasn't, maybe he had difficulties with family members and maybe with other people. But, and at his very end, when he was at his worst, why would you kick somebody when they're down, is what I'm saying. But what I do know is that what I thought was important about that documentary is they mentioned the music industry of how cutthroat it is. It just seems like I've heard these stories like all too often, and from what I'm hearing, it sounds like if the sharks are at the top, they don't care about the guppies at the bottom, and they'll eat you alive and they'll spit you out. And it's just a lot of sharks, it's a lot of wolves, and in the music industry, and it just doesn't even stop there. I believe it might even go on to the acting. I know this is separate from, people would think this is separate from music, but you notice how a lot of the black entertainers, be it if it's music or if it's even acting, if you like have like any tragedy or any bad situation that happens, it seems like it's extremely hard to redeem yourself from that. We've heard about like the Tiffany Haddish situation, Will Smith situation. We saw that. It just seems like it takes so long to redeem yourself. um, when you hear about some of these things that happen, and you almost want to tell people and have like, it's almost like you feel like you want to talk to people and say, what world we're living in. And even though we don't want to always throw race in the mix, but you have to also throw that in there, that, if you are going strong, you're doing good, and you're up there, you're doing well, and people are congratulating you and they're giving you your accolades and everything. But when you fall, I mean, you fall hard, and it is hard to redeem yourself or to dust off your knees and get back up and make amends. It just seems like there's so much of a dark cloud that is hanging over your head. And then when you happen to be a person of color, or you're black, it just seems like the dust never settles. So with the music, going back to this guy here, Rob, um, from Harlem, I believe, from New York. It sounds like he went through something. He had been going through something for quite a while. And it's what's amazing is that you never know what people are going through. All I know is that, when you hear like a few albums, a few songs or whatever, and then, some people call them one hit wonders, or they say, oh, he made a couple of hits, and then all of a sudden they drop off or whatever. And some people will start pointing fingers and say, oh, well, so and so had a drug problem, or so and so had this issue, or he had that issue. But sometimes I feel like there's a silence among people in the industry. They don't want to admit that there's some sharks or some wolves out there, and they hold the key. They're they're the ones that call the shots. They can get you the jobs. They can make a few phone calls. They can put you on top, and then they can also see you on your way out. And you know, it's hard to break in there. And when you get in there, you're in there, and so you don't want to break that bond with those people. And so even if you have to lie or you have to not tell the truth about who you're dealing with, who your manager is, or who your producer is, that they're the ones that are the ones that can either make your career or break your career and destroy it for good. So I kind of feel like that's what the music industry has in there. It has a lot of wolves and maybe some sharks in there, worse. Speaking of it, it's Halloween, but we're coming close to that. But I feel like, the way the world is with some of these industries like music and entertainment, there's a lot of monsters that people got to deal with and they don't want to say. And then you hear these tragedies, and the people you're looking at, you're like, wait a minute, okay, so if he was signed with this label, how come they didn't come to the funeral, or how come you don't see them in the documentary? So that brings the question to your mind that maybe they had something to do with the reason why this person fell so hard. Maybe they're the reason why that this person doesn't have any money, you know. um Maybe they took a large cut from whatever the person's earnings were from the sale of the album, you know. And so you do hear these crazy stories like that, and then it turned out to be real. And you've heard them. I've heard these stories on Unsung from some of the artists from like back in the, like people from like way back in the days, like from the 80s, the 70s, the late 70s and the 80s, the early 80s, when they were young, how they would sign on labels, and they didn't know, the finance part of it, and they weren't taught how to watch out for people who would take money from them and steal from them. um, and they want to tell you that you're you're big on stage and your album is big, but the person that's making more of the profits is the ones that are behind the scene, not even doing the singing, and they don't tell you. And you just, you making these stage appearances, or worse, you have somebody, they take all of your what you're worth, and then your house, your car. You hear some crazy stories from artists where they come and they just take everything, and the only thing they can do is sing, and then now they can't even have the song. They don't even got the rights to the song. I've heard crazy stories like that. Stuff like, when I the Tony Braxton story, that stuff. It's just really sad, when you hear about all of these things. So now I realize that the lives of these people, these, at the end of the day, they're just human. And you realize that they're not just the one you see on stage or that you hear in a song, but they are human beings. And then, like he said, when the lights go out, who gives a fuck about these artists? And that's the big question. And what I notice is like the thing that happened with DMX, when you hear about his story and what happened with him, and how he struggled. Of course, he had struggles with addiction and different things like that. But you know, it's funny. It's like people, like, they don't say anything when everything is all good, but then when they see the tragedies, people come from out of the woodworks. And if one of the one things that I notice is the people that you think should be showing up for the funeral or should be showing up in the documentary, you don't see them. So that brings the question to your mind: is, was that part of the problem? Were they part of the issue, part of the problem in this person's life? And so they don't want to talk about it, because I notice that some people, you never see them broke, you never see them without money, and they always in a commercial, they always in somebody video, and they always on top. But then you hear all these tragedies about the artists that were signed underneath. That's all I'm saying. My hands is off on that, but I'm just letting you know what time it is. But anyway, that documentary was really good. I don't know if you guys know that it was out. Some people probably saw it, but it was the last days of Black Rob, and it was streaming on Tubi TV. It might have been streaming on some other stations, some other streaming stations, but it was just put out not very long ago. So some people probably already saw it. But when I looked at it, I started thinking about, well, how come certain people are not in the documentary? It's people you ain't never seen before in this documentary that was supportive of him, or they was trying to make make his last moments peaceful as possible. And the ones that you think should have been in his life in the last days, you didn't see them nowhere around. They might have thrown some money at the funeral, but that's it. But I don't call that being in the life of that person. I mean, maybe you think that that's enough, but that money, you giving them money now that they dead, what can they do with that? When they was alive walking around and they needed you, you wasn't there. So that's my thing. But anyway, I'm gonna let this go. But I just thought that was pretty emotional, and it opened my eyes to see that the industry of entertainment, especially for these people right here, and the people that I've noticed, more recently, is it seems like it's really cutthroat. It's really, really cutthroat.